survey who you would recommend. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Volchenboum.
Great. Thanks, Jay, and thanks for letting me come speak today and tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing in building our Pediatric Commons and really helping researchers get access to data in new ways. I just want to start by talking about our funders, and most of the work you see here was funded by foundations like Alex's Lemonade Stand. We've had some very large donations from St. Baldrick's and Leukemia and Lymphoma Society and the Raleigh Foundation, but everything you see here was funded by a foundation, except for a few things funded by the NIH and the NCI. But for the most part, infrastructure work like the efforts we're going to discuss today have really been kickstarted by private foundations, and we're so grateful for the fundraising that they do. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the current landscape of pediatric cancer research, then go into speaking a little bit about how we leverage consensus-based decision-making for data sharing, and then finish up talking about some of our national and international efforts to build cancer data ecosystems. So really, I think for most of you, the motivation for doing this work is very clear. Childhood cancers are much less well understood than adult cancers. Drug development has stalled. There's only been 4 new drugs in the last 20 years developed with a primary indication for pediatric cancer. Studies don't reflect the diversity in our populations. Developing countries, as we'll discuss, have an enormous disparity in their cure rates and access to care. And very little is understood about the long-term impacts of cancer treatment, especially with some of the new emerging therapies. This is emblematic of what we're facing in pediatric cancer and actually all types of cancer research. In the middle, this is a binder showing 1 cycle of chemotherapy for a patient of mine. That's a handwritten adverse event note. These are all handwritten, and then they're faxed back to the sponsor for adverse events. On the left is a set of laptops. Each one of those laptops is connected to a different pharmaceutical company and their own customized system for data entry. You can see the usernames and passwords taped to the front of each laptop. And on the right is a calendar that we give, a kind of calendar that we would give patients to tell them how to take their chemotherapy and when to come in for chemotherapy. This calendar is generated by hand in Microsoft Word. So, I mean, imagine this is 2020 and this is how we're practicing medicine. It's hard to believe that with all the technological advances we have, that that these advances haven't made their way down to clinical trials. And this was really the motivating factor for starting to develop in this space, was how can we use technology to make these to make clinical trials easier to easier to make happen. We we look at data standards and we see that there's huge problems with how we collect data. This is just a slide showing from one of the places where we store genomic data, the Gene Expression Omnibus, looking at how the term age is cataloged throughout the different studies in GEO. And imagine if you were searching for the field age, and look at all the different ways it's represented here. This is a blatant disregard for a standard. You only need 1 standard for how you represent age. You don't need the 30 or 35 standards that are shown here. And this is just one easy example for age. Imagine how this problem persists for things like stage of disease or tumor grade. As you know, pediatric cancer is very rare, thankfully rare. Of the 18 million new cases in the world every year, only about 1% of those are in children. But it's a rare disease that makes it very hard to study. It means that we have to work really hard to bring data together in order to have enough data to do research. One example, if you think about pediatric lymphoma, there's about 2,200 cases in the US every year. That's not a ton of cases if you want to start studying things like rare genetic defects. Worldwide, though, there's almost 40,000 cases of pediatric lymphoma every year, and that is actually a number that would be feasible to study. And so if we can start to bring together some of these data from around the world, we can really start to do more impactful research. Pediatricians understood very early on that they had to bring data together in order to run clinical trials. The first cooperative group for pediatric cancer was formed in the mid-50s. And in the year 2000, the main groups coalesced to form the Children's Oncology Group. The neuroblastoma group, the International Neuroblastoma Research Group, began their work in 2004, starting to build consensus standards for neuroblastoma, which led to us forming the first data commons in 2013. In 2017, we built our Instruct, our rhabdomyosarcoma data commons, and now in this last year or two, we're starting to work with the NCI to help with their National Childhood Cancer Data Initiative and starting to do some pan-cancer-wide initiatives for pediatric cancer. So why do we need data commons in the first place? Well, the landscape has changed. There's just too much data to store. There's now terabytes and petabytes of large-scale data, imaging data, genomic data. It takes way too long to transfer those data. It's very expensive to analyze those data. And as I'm going to explain, there's a pervasive lack of standards for that information. We really need to move to a system where we have standardized data available to everybody with the tools that they need to analyze those data. So Data Commons is really just a cloud-based system where researchers can put clinical data into the commons, clinicians can put patient data, there can be genomic data, and then users, like shown on the right here, can access those data, but they don't have to download the data. They can use it in the cloud, they can use tools that are in the cloud, and they don't have to worry about expensive installations of hardware and hiring special people to develop the applications. Data Commons is all about bringing data together, standardizing it, aggregating it, and using it in a cloud-based infrastructure. Many of you are familiar with the Genomic Data Commons, which is one of the first and largest data commons to launch. And I'm sure many of you also are aware and use the Gabriella Miller Kids First Data Resource Center, which is also a data commons linking together pediatric cancer data and structural birth defects data. And so the commons paradigm is one that is now extremely important for researchers. Fundamental to building a data commons is that you have to have modular components that can work together, and you can share data and you can share tools. We build everything as open source software. You must be able to share it so that other people can use it and update it and contribute to it. We rely on the community to help foster new ideas and help us expand out the ways in which we use the commons. And as you'll hear me say many times today, everything has to be standards based. We have to all be speaking the same language when we put data into a commons. So the first data commons that we built was for the neuroblastoma group. And as far back as 2004, the neuroblastoma group brought together not only the Children's Oncology Group, but also the Pediatric Neuroblastoma Consortia from Germany, Japan, and also the rest of Europe. And they were able to put together almost 9,000 patients with neuroblastoma in the first incarnation of the neuroblastoma data commons. This was a tremendous feat. Neuroblastoma affects maybe 500-600 kids a year in the United States. So it's really hard to study, especially if you're going to just have a few institutions. But to bring together 9,000 patients was a huge win for the INRG. The bad part was that the data were sequestered in an Excel spreadsheet. And if you didn't know the statistician that had the Excel sheet, or if you didn't have access to that person, you didn't have access to the data. It's also very hard to update data in an Excel sheet. It's hard to have any sort of governance over those data. So we took this on about 5 years ago and decided to put these data into a data commons infrastructure and make it available to the world. So our front end of our cohort discovery tool is available at the link shown here, and it's available to everybody. So anybody can go to our website, can come in. There's 21,000 patients now in the database, and you can search over any of the 30 data elements for neuroblastoma. But also I want you to note that there's external data elements here. And what that means is that not only can you search over the clinical data of the patients in our data commons, you can also connect to external data like data in the target database. That's genomic data and high throughput sequencing data. Or we can connect to the tissue core. So you can do a search and see which patients have tissue samples available in the tissue core. And this is really where the big payoff for building a commons comes in. It's allowing people to find a cohort of patients and then find other connected data sources that they can bring together to study in a single place. And so we're very excited about bringing together more and more data sources and then connecting to more and more external sources. And I'll talk a bit about how this relates to what the NCI is building now as a national infrastructure and how we're participating in that effort. We also have brought in images to the neuroblastoma commons. So for many of the patients who are children's oncology group patients, we've been able to bring in MRI and CT scans and MIBG scans. And we have researchers now using the data commons to study image-defined factors and how they relate to prognosis. And we're also building visualization and analytics tools so that once you define your cohort, you can actually perform an analysis immediately and you can see survival curves. You can download the curves. You can try different variables and see how they affect what the predicted survival is or what the survival was on the trials. And we see an expansion of these tools in our platform, but more importantly, we are going to link out to other tools that are being developed on other platforms so that users can take advantage of lots of different infrastructure. On the heels of the success of the neuroblastoma commons, we were approached by the rhabdomyosarcoma community to build a soft tissue sarcoma commons. And so we worked not only with the children's oncology group, but we worked with the other 4 consortia shown here on the left, the European consortia. And then we chose the trials that are listed on the right as the first set of trials we would harmonize and bring into this data commons. Of course, this required extensive work in building a data dictionary and bringing those data together. Since then, we've had a rapid expansion of our data commons. We have a St. Baldrick's Consortium grant, and so now we've expanded our data dictionary work and our data commons efforts to include almost all areas of pediatric cancer. And for the areas that we haven't moved into yet, we have a timeline and a roadmap for bringing those areas in as well. We keep a progress tracker, and as you can see here, for germ cell tumors, neuroblastoma, and soft tissue sarcoma, we're doing quite well. We've built our data dictionaries. We have set up our consortia. We have many cases in the commons already, and for neuroblastoma and germ cell tumors, we already have over 50 papers published. Soft tissue sarcoma just had its first couple papers accepted for publication based on the data in the Instruct Data Commons. And for our other commons, we're in various places with our development of data dictionaries and building the infrastructure for those commons, and we hope to continually update this tracker as we move ahead with these other commons. So our 2 main commons that we stood up in the last 5 years, as I said, were the neuroblastoma and the rhabdomyosarcoma. We have over 25,000 patients in these commons already. The data are updated, so every 6 months we get an update from the Children's Oncology Group with new survival outcomes for those patients, and we update the data. We have extensive auditing of the data so that anytime a data set is published, we're able to freeze that data set and we know which data were used for that publication. We're bringing in more rhabdomyosarcoma data, and for the other commons, we're working on the data sharing agreements to bring in those data as well. So our vision for a pediatric commons is one of an integrated platform. We see ourselves being able to set up data commons for many areas of pediatric cancer, but of course we know that we're not going to be able to do every area, and there's certain tumors that may have other registries or data commons that are already very successful, and in those cases we want to link out to those commons so that the user can see which data are available and which patients. But the important thing that I said already is that we need to link out to other available resources. So on the bottom, I have imaging, biobank data, genomic data, and there's emerging sets of high throughput data for pediatric cancer. And we want to link to those data sets based on a common identifier that we have for these kids. We want it to be relatively transparent to the user. We think the user should be able to come in and search over the available data, see what else is available, but not have to keep jumping around to different sites and trying to figure out where everything is. We want the user to have an easy process of seeing what's available and aggregating those data together. Once you have your commons set up, you can do all sorts of innovative types of research. It allows you to look across groups. That's something that is currently very difficult. So maybe you want to study across pediatric solid tumors. It allows us to do more extensive survivorship research because we have longitudinal outcome data on these kids. We can do cross-disease biomarker studies by looking amongst the different groups for similar biomarkers. And as we have new therapies that work across different types of cancers, like our new immunotherapies, it's even more important to be able to study across the different diseases. Pediatric cancer as a whole is rare, but even within pediatric cancer, we have ultra rare subtypes. And by bringing together international data, we can really hope to study these rare subtypes better. And we do know a lot about long-term effects of chemotherapy, but as the new treatments emerge, it's going to be even more important to have these data commons to study the long-term effects of these therapies. So I'm going to move to talk a little bit about our consensus-based decision-making and how we leverage that for better data sharing. So to build a commons, we've come up with a repeatable paradigm that's worked well for us. The first and most important thing is to build a consortium, and that's to build trust between groups. This requires international stakeholders to come together to understand that the goal is not to take away anyone's rights when it comes to sharing data, but the goal is to put data in one place and allow people to use it to do research. You have to decide what your scientific goals are. You have to know what questions you're going to ask when you put the data together. And so that's some of the first questions we ask researchers is, what are you going to use these data for? How are you going to study pediatric cancer if you have this larger set of data? We have extensive data governance in place. That is important for things like publication policies, determining who can use data and how those data are to be used. I'll spend some time talking about data dictionaries, and it's completely necessary to have a robust dictionary so everybody's speaking the same language. We have to transform the data, so meaning that the data that were collected in all sorts of different formats has to come together to be aggregated. And of course, funding is incredibly important because once we get the commons set up, we need to be able to sustain the commons and keep it going. So data standards, not the most sexy topic, of course, but it's something that is probably one of the most important things that we do, and we'll try to make it interesting for you. There's lots of different standards out there, and there's no shortage of groups that have tried to build data standards for different areas, and no one standard is actually going to be the answer to any particular need. For pediatrics, data standards have not been developed thoroughly, and if we look at the emerging data standards or the established data standards that we have, pediatric cancer is actually not well developed and requires a lot more study. So here's what we do. This is painstaking work. It's something that we have fine-tuned now over the last couple of years. We start with case report forms. So on the left there are a list of 5 international consortia that study pediatric soft tissue sarcoma. We take those case report forms, and those are the forms that people use to collect data for clinical trials, and they fill out either on a web form or in some cases pen and paper. We take those case report forms, we try to understand what are the different fields people are collecting, and then we build data dictionaries from those fields. And then the hard part is to get consensus on how can we all speak the same language. And so you can imagine that in the US, we might call a stage 1 tumor something that's quite different than what Europeans would call a stage 1 tumor. We might find certain sites of disease are important to catalog, and the European groups might decide on other sites of disease. And so spending time in these groups and trying to ballot and get consensus on these elements is incredibly important, because what that lets you do is build harmonized case report forms, meaning that going forward, everyone will collect data in the same format, making it much easier to share, making it much easier to study. Even more important, we are working with the National Cancer Institute to update their standards so that even if somebody was building a form and they didn't even know about our work, they would go to the National Cancer Institute, pull down the standards, and they would have been updated by us to the international consensus. So our goal is to take all of the disparate silos of collecting data around the world and try to create a single standard so everybody can collect data in the same way. This is an example of the work we did with the sarcoma community. It took us about 3 years. We had it looks like 8 international meetings. Of course, the last one was virtual, and we spent a lot of time going over every single element in the data dictionary, coming to a consensus, deciding how we were going to harmonize the data, and ultimately using the data to start to publish papers. This has been a great example of starting essentially in 2017 with nothing, with just disparate groups collecting data in different ways, and now having an established group of pediatric oncologists that are all attuned to the same data standards and trying to collect data in the same way and use those data for research. So how do you choose the right standard? I mean, for us, it's all about having consistency across cancer groups. We want to make sure that if we're talking about gender or race or ethnicity, that we're doing it the same way across cancer groups. And not only that, we want to make sure that we can connect to other non-pediatric cancer groups so that you could do even larger studies. We want to make sure we can connect to data that's outside of our sources, like genomic data, imaging data, and other types. So as I mentioned, we work with the NCI to understand what their standards are, and we have a very active data dictionary work group that works with an international group of oncologists, statisticians, data standards experts, surgeons, radiologists, data scientists, and that's really how we get consensus, is getting all of those different stakeholders to come to an agreement on the standard. So our interest really now is to build a pan-pediatric cancer data dictionary. We want to have a way to collect data over all pediatric cancer that is not necessarily customized for each pediatric cancer group. Now, you might think that people were already doing that, but the way that clinical trials have grown up for pediatric cancer, each group has devised their own way of collecting data. So our work now is to try to work across these groups to try to gain consensus. So we took our 5 initial data dictionaries that we built, and we tried to find comparisons and commonalities across them. And then we looked to the other standards, like the other standards I showed you, to try to find where there was commonalities amongst the standards. We built our data model. We include things like the protocol the patient was on, what tests they had, what treatments they had, and so forth. And now we're using that overall dictionary to now inform the production of other dictionaries, like our Hodgkin, our leukemia, our Ewing and osteosarcoma dictionaries. And we're really hoping to build this continued detailed guidance on how we implement data into the data commons. So by starting with disease-specific commons, we've now moved out to all pediatric cancer data dictionary. A lot of this is dependent on being able to create these different types of tables that we will populate with the data. Obviously, this is not meant to get into the details, but just to show you the wide variety of data we're collecting. Certain things I think are obvious, like a patient's demographics or what protocol they were on, but we're also trying to collect things like how much radiation they had, or what kind of immunotherapy they had, or what kind of treatment they had. You would think we'd have a really good line on what therapies patients have, but until now, we don't have a good way to track that. In fact, the most common way people track the therapy that a patient gets is by just knowing what protocol they were treated on. And then you can only really try to infer what treatment they were supposed to get. But the next step for our work is actually to get into the electronic health record and pull out the actual treatment data, so we actually know what the patient got and we're not guessing anymore. It's also important to look across pediatric cancers to find where those commonalities are. So if you look at the very top line, looking at something as simple as what the patient's sex is, most of the groups listed on the right, as expected, would use male, female, or unknown. But germ cell tumors, which can affect the sex organs, obviously have to have another category called indeterminate. So we have to try to figure out, how do we harmonize that together? Because for the other groups, they don't need that data element, and we have to find a way so that all the groups can have a single standard for sex in this case. We also are tracking genetic defects like the ones listed at the bottom, and many of these genetic defects are very specific for a particular tumor type, but there are some that overlap between tumor types, and we want to make sure that for mutations, like say for an ALK mutation, we can look at that mutation over several different types of tumors. So this is painstaking work. This dictionary here has hundreds and hundreds of lines and variables, and it takes months and months of effort to go through every line and to to work with every group to gain consensus. So how do we build our consortia? How do we create the data governance necessary to accomplish this? It's been a long process, and it's not easy to get groups to agree to do this. We have quite a few barriers to get past. There's local, national, international regulations. All of you are aware of HIPAA regulations and the GDPR European regulations, which make it, create quite a high bar for exchanging data. And even for data that we consider de-identified in the US, the European GDPR regulations still make it difficult to share those data. And so we have to work through a lot of these regulatory issues. It's been very important to have policies and procedures that govern how data are contributed, how people access and those data, how the data are released. You can imagine that people will only put data into your data commons if they have some assurance that their data are going to be safe and that they will have some say over how the data are used. We want to make sure that every group that contributes data is in some way represented and that they have a say in how the data are used. As I mentioned, the data harmonization is a huge barrier because it requires each group to put forth effort to take the data that they've collected over the years and convert it into this new standard. Of course, going forward, we hope that everybody collects data in the new standard, but for now, we're going back and taking thousands and thousands of patients and transforming those data into the new standard so we can study it. And then, of course, building these commons in a sustainable way is extremely important. And once the initial funding is used to build the commons, we have to think of creative ways to perpetuate the funding and have sustainability. Like I mentioned, we're building these disease level commons like AML, ALL, Hodgkin, and so forth. But right now, our interest is on top of that to build an overarching consortium for the entire Pediatric Cancer Data Commons. And so we're building an executive leadership team, and we want to have governance that thinks about how all the data commons work together. Again, this was a surprise to me. I would think that everybody in all these commons already know each other and they already work together, but I guess not surprisingly, many of these commons, many of these disease groups have been relatively siloed. And so now we're doing a lot of work trying to get all these groups to work together to see the benefits of having collaboration and the benefits of having a common data dictionary for data sharing. So how do we build one of those initial consortia like the INRG or the sarcoma, the Instruct Consortium? Well, we try to get international leaders to come together. We put a memorandum of understanding together, which basically defines the loose rules for how the consortium is going to work. We build an executive committee with the leaders of the groups, and it's really important to get champions involved. As an example, for the neuroblastoma group, we had Sue Cohn and Andy Pearson as international champions for building that consortium. For the sarcoma group, we had Doug Hawkins took the lead in the US, and it really helped us create international consensus for moving forward and building the commons in the first place. We have standardized procedures for how we accept data, how we approve requests, and it's really important to assure the groups from the start that you're going to take good care of their data and that they're going to have ultimate control over it. And then we build out work groups from there. And so the sarcoma group has a surgery work group that is working on papers related to surgery. And that's actually what drives the group forward are the scientific questions that are being asked. I mentioned the memorandum of understanding, but we actually spend most of our time building things like data contributor agreements and data use agreements. We spend an enormous amount of time negotiating these agreements. Anytime we accept data from a foreign institution, the lawyers at the University of Chicago have to negotiate with that institution to take the data and to put the data into our data commons. Same thing in the US. We spend a lot of time working with the Children's Oncology Group to negotiate the movement of data. And now we're trying to work with other non-COG groups in the US to move their data as well. I mention it here because it's a real bottleneck for us. It sometimes can take months and sometimes take years to put these data agreements in place. But once they're in place, it allows the data to be moved and the data to be used. For the way that we're governing our data commons, we have a couple important principles. by far the most important thing is that we want to lift barriers to connect researchers to data. For too long, it's been impossible for researchers to get access to lots of different data. They have to go to many sources. The data are in different formats, and we really want to make sure that the primary goal is to make it easier for researchers to get access to data. We think it's really important for stakeholders to have approval of the data. If somebody is going to give their hard-earned data up for placement in the commons, they should have approval and say on how those data are used. The same contributors should be able to understand how the data are being released and published, and they should have visibility into that. We believe that every group that contributes data should be represented in the governance of the data commons. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of difference in regulations between the US, Europe, and the rest of the world. And we're having to learn on a daily basis how these differences affect our ability to collect and store data. So our ongoing opportunities are to add new types of cancer to the commons. You know, we have almost every type of pediatric cancer accounted for right now, but at least for the common ones, but we want to bring in as many as possible. We're trying to expand to other parts of the world, as I'll discuss in a minute. We want to try to address global disparities in cancer, access to cancer treatment and cancer outcomes. And then we want to develop some real-time applications like clinical trials matching, which I'll show a little bit about at the very end. Oh, actually, I will show you now. So clinical trials matching is something that we're very excited about. The Leukemia and Lymphoma Society has built, has funded the building of an algorithm, of a clinical decision support tool that is based on an algorithm that matches patients to clinical trials. And we're going to be releasing the first version of this tool in the next year. And what it's going to do, it's going to allow clinicians to go and select from a number of patient characteristics, and the algorithm will tell the clinician which clinical trials that are open are a match for that patient, at least based on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. This is a very difficult task because just pulling out the criteria from the trial is difficult, and then to match that up to disparate types of patient characteristics can be very challenging. But we're already working, we already have working on a prototype of this, and we're hoping to release the first version this year. And we believe that that better clinical trials matching will really decrease the barriers for kids to get access to care. Okay, and so in the last part, I just want to talk a little bit about our approach to thinking about national and international ecosystems for cancer research. So research does not benefit all children equally, of course. The vast majority of kids in the world that are diagnosed with cancer, 80%, live in lower middle income countries. And research, of course, doesn't reflect this diversity, because the research that's being done is being done mainly in the US, Europe, and in some parts of Asia. And those data that are collected don't reflect the large amounts of diversity in the pediatric cancer population. This is a startling curve. If you look on the right, for pediatric ALL, the cure rates now for North America and Europe and Australia exceed 90%, and in some cases approach 95% for certain types of acute lymphoblastic leukemia. But if you live in an underdeveloped country, your cure rates can be way below 75%, sometimes below 50%. This is a disease that if you show up now in Chicago, you have a 95% cure rate, and in other parts of the world, over half the kids die. And that's just a startling revelation, when the therapies and the treatment of these kids should be relatively straightforward. And we really need to address these disparities. So the WHO announced a global initiative for childhood cancer about 2 years ago to reach 60% survival rate for all children with cancer by 2030, which would represent a doubling in the cure rate, saving 1 million additional lives per year. And this is a lofty goal. It's going to require a lot of innovation in these countries, but we think the work that we're doing in data standards will be incredibly important to this type of initiative. The data commons work that we're doing has the opportunity to start to close some of these gaps. Here's a recent paper that was published by the neuroblastoma group based on data in the neuroblastoma commons, and they actually looked at some very inexpensive tests like LDH and ferritin as being strong prognostic factors, which in developing countries could be incredibly useful for looking at stratifying patients with neuroblastoma, especially in areas where more expensive tests aren't available. You're not going to get NMIC amplification testing in an underdeveloped country as easy as you could get LDH and ferritin. So we think that there's huge gains to be made by studying the data in the commons and helping to use those data to help decrease some of these disparities. Alex's Lemonade Stand helped sponsor a symposium on health disparities about 4 years ago, and some of the takeaways were the need to better evaluate kids' exposures, social determinants of health, genetic factors, and really to try to understand by using things like genomics and other high throughput testing how both the child's germline as well as the tumor somatic mutational landscape might affect certain subsets of the population. And this could actually be instrumental in understanding why kids in underdeveloped countries have different outcomes with similar therapies. We think that the data commons work that we're doing will make access to these data much easier and make it easier to study these disparities across continents. So many of you have heard of the Childhood Cancer Data Initiative announced over a year ago. This is an initiative to fund $50 million a year for 10 years for childhood cancer. The first $50 million was recently released. And this is an incredible initiative to try to better leverage the data we're collecting for childhood cancer. The goals are to maximize every opportunity for a kid with cancer, whether they're on a trial or not. Anytime a child is seen and treated, we should be able to leverage those data and understand more about the child's cancer. We want to make sure that there's a connected data infrastructure, which is what I've been talking about this whole time, better ways to enable sharing of data. We want to figure out how to make data work better. How can clinicians use these data to better find opportunities? How can researchers use the data to study cancer? And as part of that is developing better tools and methods to extract knowledge from the data. And this goes back to what I talked about, the importance of having a commons infrastructure where you can have tools and analytic methods available to you in the commons. The goals are, as I said, are to bring all these things together, but to improve treatments, to bring better data together, and to make the data easy to use. These might seem obvious, but as I've been talking about this entire time, for such a long time, data has been collected in these silos that just trying to connect these different sources is going to be a huge effort, and that's what a lot of the funding is going toward. There's many sources of pediatric cancer data, and this is just some of them. Everything from the work that we're doing by collecting data from pediatric clinical trials to data that's in St. Jude Cloud. I mentioned the Kids First initiative. Target is part of the Genomic Data Commons. There's the Alex's supported work that Casey does with his Childhood Cancer Data Lab. There's a lot of pediatric cancer data, and we want to try to help connect those data together. And the CCDI's success will be measured by how well we can connect patients and connect data for researchers to use. One of the big emerging efforts is this National Childhood Cancer Registry. And Lynn Penberthy gave me permission to use this very preliminary slide of this registry that they're building. It's quite innovative in that they're going to take pediatric cancer registry data from every institution treating children, but then they're going to go get other types of data. They're going to link up to Walgreens and CVS data, and they're going to get data from LexisNexis, data from state records, data from the Children's Oncology Group, and they're going to really build a huge registry that not only has the normally extracted cancer registry data, but has data from the electronic health records. This is a huge initiative. It's part of the CCDI effort, and it's just getting underway, and our group is trying to help with the formulation of some of the data standards that are going to be used. This is a figure that's incredibly important now, because this is what the new cancer research data commons ecosystem is starting to look like. So you have a cloud-based ecosystem of interconnected commons. Those are the cylinders shown in the middle, the clinical, proteomics, genomics, imaging, and so forth. And all of these data sources need to be connected. And within the cloud, like I mentioned earlier, you have to have ways to visualize and analyze the data. You have to have consistent data models and data dictionaries, and you have to have ways for users to analyze those data. The users are listed along the bottom. Things like clinicians, researchers, even patients and families are going to want to use these data and to study these data. And you have to have a way to not only authenticate who the person is trying to use the data, but then authorize them to use different types of data, whether it's high throughput genomic data or whether it's clinical data. You have to have a way for users to access those data securely. And so this, each of these tools and each part of this is a very intricate process, and it's turning into an amazing ecosystem of interconnected data sources. Part of the success of this is going to be having a way to harmonize data between these groups. So there's a Center for Cancer Data Harmonization that we're helping run. And what the CCDH is doing is looking over not only pediatric, but adult cancer as well, and trying to facilitate both retrospective and prospective harmonization of data. So as I talked about before, building a standard lets you not only take old data and harmonize it, but lets you then power the collection of data going forward. We want to work with the community and educate the community for using standards. It's incredibly important that we increase the literacy around this, because nothing prevents a researcher from just creating their own data collection form and collecting data any way they want. What we hope that people will learn that they need to go to a collection of standards, a library of standards, and to collect data in a way that's going to be allow the data to be aggregated much more easily. And then to really find agreement amongst these communities. The genomics community and the proteomics community are a whole different set of scientists. And to try to get them to agree on standards that allow sharing between their data commons is not an easy task. There has to be both carrots and sticks. You have to entice people to use the standards and show them how it's going to make their work easier. But you also have to tie things like funding and different types of rewards to not using those data. So I've been encouraging groups that fund research that part of the requirements for getting funding should be that they agree that they're going to use standardized data when they publish their data. So I think this is an incredibly important effort. The Cancer Research Data Commons is something you're going to be hearing much more about, and especially as the Child Cancer Data Initiative funds are spent, you're going to be hearing more about this. So that was a broad whirlwind tour of the work that we're doing, and why we think there's a whole new way of sharing pediatric data and doing research. I hope I convinced you that to study pediatric cancer, you have to have really good collaboration and sharing between groups. Data sharing has to be built on a foundation of trust. It would be impossible for us to work across these different groups if there wasn't an element of trust that the data would be used and would be used in a secure way that is governed according to policy and procedure. We really feel that it's critical to connect these disparate data types. We have to be able to connect the genomic data and the imaging data. It used to be impossible to even consider a study where you would take clinical data and genomic data and imaging data and study that all together. And that's exactly the kind of data that we're powering now by connecting the patient identifiers across those different data types. We think that having pediatric standards on the international stage is going to really lead to a future of collecting data across trials that's very easy to aggregate. And if we can extend this now into other areas, other parts of the world, we think that's really going to help us address some of the disparities in cancer outcomes. Right now, if you collected a large set of data from hospitals in underserved areas, you wouldn't be able to harmonize those data. They'd be in all sorts of different formats and collected according to either no standard or to a standard that no one uses. But if we can disseminate our standards out to these communities, the data can be collected in a way that would make it much easier to share. these consensus standards are absolutely critical, both on the national stage as well as the international stage. And we think that early adoption of these standards is absolutely critical for accelerating progress. If you've already built your data collection forms and then you decide to see what the standards are, you're too late. And so we're really trying to work with groups on the front end and trying to get them to accept the data standards and integrate them into their research from the start. So we have a pretty big team that's been doing the work. We divide up into a programming group, and we have a data standards group, and we have a group that does all of our project management. We have a person that does our regulatory work, and we continue to grow in all these areas. And we're very excited about all the different emerging areas of pediatric cancer data that we can study. We're happy to hear from folks about innovations. We have a parent and advocate program. We have a young investigator program. So we would love to hear from you with suggestions and ideas, especially for folks that want to get involved in these efforts. And I'll stop here, but I just want to mention again that this is all foundation driven, and we're so grateful for the work that groups like Alex's Lemonade Stand and others do in raising money for this type of critical research. So I'm going to hand it back to Jay. I think Jay's been hopefully accumulating some not too difficult questions that we can answer, and hopefully we have time to do that. I think we do.
Thank you, Sam. That was very eye-opening what you guys are doing. I know that we've run together and talked a little bit about it, but just to hear it in depth was very useful for me. We have a few questions that have come in so far. If other people have questions, you can put them over in the chat. And with that, we're going to jump right into the questions. The first question says, thank you very much for the talk, an excellent initiative. This person is wondering, to what extent do you utilize or incorporate tools developed by ICGC, TCGA, CBio Portal, et cetera?
Yeah, so of course there's a whole, there's a ton of tools that have been developed by those groups mentioned, as well as now through Gabriella Miller and Genomic Data Commons, and we would love to interoperate with these tools. The most important thing for interoperating is that there's an interface or an endpoint for us to connect to. So as I mentioned, our goal is not to create a ton of new tools. Our goal is to leverage these tools. So we're working with some of these groups to try to understand how can we either pull in their algorithm for analysis, or how can we send the data off to use their tool. And so, like I said, our goal is not to reinvent these tools, and we would love to connect to many of these groups. This is all in the early stages though, and as we go forward, we hope to integrate more and more of these platforms.
Okay, and then the follow-up to that was, beyond clinical data, do you also collect molecular data, genomics, transcriptomics? This came in early, so yeah. I think you answered that.
But I think the important point is that we don't want to have any redundant data. So if data are in Target or if they're in Gabriella Miller, we want to connect to those data. But there have been cases where data just don't have a home. And we try to make sure that we can house those data securely if it's data that just doesn't have another place to be. So we're willing to do that work, but we never want to have redundant data. We want to always connect to the original source. It's a good question.
And then Linda Resar. Hi, Linda. Nice to hear from you. Says, great talk. And then she said, gene expression databases are limited in some pediatric cancers, ALL, AML, since prior studies have focused on mutations. Does Commons include or link to RNA-seq or microarray gene expression data, ChIP-seq data for epigenetic markers, et cetera?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So obviously we're connecting to all the modern sources like Target and Gabriella Miller. One thing we've done recently is connect to the GEO, the Gene Expression Omnibus database, which has a lot of expression data. To do that is actually more difficult than we expected, because when researchers do this type of analysis, the identifiers they put with the data are just identifiers that they make up in their lab. So it's like their initial and then some number. And so what we have to do is go back and figure out, how do those patients connect to patients in our commons? So that involves often trying to take those patients, figure out, are they children's oncology group patients and what their children's oncology group identifier is, so that we can connect the clinical data we have with the expression data. And so far we've done that with a few studies. And if you look at our cohort tool, you'll see gene expression data listed as an external source that you can connect to, but we want to increase that. So if other people have ideas or sources of data that they think we should be connecting to, they should please bring those forward so we can try to make those connections.
So someone else was wondering if you would be willing to share your PowerPoint.
Yeah, absolutely. So as usual, we were working on it up until talk time, but we'll make it available to, we'll send it to you, Jay, or to your team, and then you can disseminate it freely, and we're happy to get it out there.
Great. Another person said, fantastic presentation, very informative, great work. I thought it was interesting, Sam, when you said we're trying to get standards. You know, people think about what your data is going to look like ahead of time and follow the standards. And one of the things that we've been doing at Alex is trying to really push people to agree to share their information. But I think it's important that we take into account what does the information look like, right? So I think that is something that we can do, including, you know, encouraging and, you know, people to share their information. And I guess we do use a little bit of carrot or a little bit of stick, but then also making sure that it does fit into the Commons platform. Because, you know, we've run into that a little bit when we were working at the CCDL, where people label things differently, and it makes so much work for people that are trying to use the data when you just have a column that has different names from different researchers.
And I think it's a literacy problem in a lot of ways. I think people just don't know. And I think people are happy to do the right thing if they have access to the resources. So that's definitely an area where, with the enormous reach that your group has, that we can start to hopefully, and we can work with Casey on this, trying to increase the education that people have when they develop their data collection tools, and then make it easier for them to transform and upload the data. That's some of the work we're doing with the CCDH, is creating tools so people can transform the data automatically. But it's we're a long ways from making this a seamless task.
So another comment came in that said it was a wonderful and informative presentation. And then another question that says, what is Dr. Volchenboum's self-assessment for how comprehensive the PCDC is today? Are there data sources or classes of cancer that are clearly missing?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we've clearly been very opportunistic thus far. We've chosen to go with the largest cancer groups, and because those tend to generate the most funding. What we're doing now, though, is trying to fill in the gaps. Trying to take the tumors that are much more rare and use the funding we already have and what we've learned to try to fill in those gaps. We've been working very closely hand in hand with Children's Oncology Group to try to go through each of the groups within COG and to try to leverage the completed clinical trials. So that's one of our metrics of success, obviously, is our coverage of different pediatric cancer types. But I think another metric that I think is very important is how much we've been able to take our standards and get them into the vernacular. So it was very reaffirming when the National Cancer Institute came to us and said, hey, can you help us take your standards and get them into our national database? That told us we were doing something right. So the more that we can inform future data collection by getting our standards into the NCI's database, I think is another important metric of success, ultimately, so that every trial that's conducted is using the same standard. I think those are important metrics as well.
A couple more questions came in, so I hope you have a few more minutes. Mm-hmm. And then, as you know, in the childhood cancer space, there's a lot of foundations and charities that focus on one type of cancer. So if there was a charity that focused on one type of cancer that you guys were not strong in right now, and they were willing to give you money, would you be willing to put that effort towards a particular type of cancer?
Yeah, so not only would we be willing, we're starting to do that. And so we just had a group come forward for one particular type of cancer. It's actually happened twice now. The Raleigh Foundation gave us a directed donation to build an osteosarcoma data commons. And it wasn't enough to build a full-blown commons, but it's enough to get it kicked off. We would love to work with interested groups, especially looking at more rare and ultra-rare tumors, in trying to jumpstart the development of those commons. And oftentimes, those groups actually have connections into existing data sources. They know about the registries that have been built. They know about the databases that are laying around with their favorite researcher. And those fundraising groups are actually instrumental often in having us get access to the initial data. So we would love to hear more about opportunities that people bring forward like that. That's a fantastic question.
Along that vein, someone said they have a HERA fund at St. Baldrick's, and would you be willing to help them write up some rationale to require, which might be too strong of a word, that studies they fund adhere to certain standards?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it was over a year ago that Becky Weaver came to me to ask to help develop some language that they could start to put into their RFPs that would require adherence to standards for sharing. I'm not sure how that was disseminated, and so I would love to help any group that wants to work to put those into their grant applications. I was scared a second you were going to tell me I had to shave my head again, so I'm glad that wasn't the request.
You got the hair, man. You got the hair. One more question here. It says, can you speak more about incorporating, and I'm not familiar with this term, but the sociome data in addressing pediatric cancer?
This is great. So we're so excited about this. We're doing a lot of this work locally at UChicago for some of our other initiatives. And this is the idea of bringing in data like financial toxicity data or environmental data, or data that kids collect that on Fitbits they would wear, and step and activity data, cell phone GPS data, where do kids go after school? There's obviously tons of regulatory issues to get past, but imagine a time when our data is not restricted to these rigid forms that we're collecting on a clinical trial, but that every aspect of a child's data is collected. We could learn so much more about their cancer. We could learn so much more about their therapy. If you had a way to use a Fitbit to detect if a child was less active because of nausea and vomiting, for instance, you could study them at home easily without having to wait till they came back 2 weeks later and assess them that way. You could look at how they're sleeping. You could look at how active they are. So, but the sociome is much bigger than that. Like I said, it's looking at all these other social determinants of health, economic disparities, environmental factors. We're so excited about doing that, and we would love to do a pilot project or two in that area.
Well, that's great. We have someone that we probably could connect you to that is doing some work in that area. That's the last question that we have that came in, but we're just about out of time. So I think it was perfect timing, but yeah, I just want to thank you again, Sam, for your time and for the effort you put into this. I think it's really important. Appreciate the talk, and I'm sure that we'll talk again soon. Look forward to the time when we can run together again.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Thanks, Jay. And thanks everyone for letting us come speak today. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you.